Well, here we are with another edition of GDO Unspoken, where we discuss stuff we don't typically talk about but probably should. And I've got a very special guest online named David Gillespie. How are you, David?
Yeah, good to be here, Gary.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. Now, I'm just going to put you on the spot here. I know we've got no real preconceived questions here and you're dialing in. I appreciate your time. If I asked you right now, way things are going out of 5, 1's terrible, 5's awesome. How are you travelling at the moment?
Oh, probably 4.
That's pretty high. That's good.
Yeah, pretty good. Yeah.
That's nice. And what's something that at the moment you are grateful for?
I nothing going wrong is usually a good measure of things I'm grateful for.
Well, look, I haven't really introduced you, but I mean, I know you're a speaker, you're an author, you're a social entrepreneur. Look, can you explain yourself in like 30 to 60 seconds for the people who are tuning into the show?
Well, it's hard. So I guess I'm best known for writing a book about 2007 called Sweet Poison,
Yep.
which is about why we shouldn't eat sugar, which doesn't sound like a particularly controversial thing to write a book about, but unbelievably in 2007 it was controversial and generated a lot of interest and eventually sold an awful lot of books. And when a publisher finds you sell a lot of books, they let you write books whatever you want. And since then, I've written about 14 books about various things, including how to choose a school for your kids, why we shouldn't eat seed oils, studies for working with psychopaths and avoiding them, how the teenage brain works, which is I think what we're going to focus on mostly today, the adult brain works, and what you can do about addiction, anxiety, and depression. So you name it, I've probably written books about most of it. I've never written a book about the thing that I'm actually trained in, which is a lawyer, and I'm still a lawyer, I practice law, so I write always about things that my job doesn't depend upon, which gives me the perfect ability to just look at the evidence says without caring that I might say something that gets me fired. So I have the ability to look from the outside in most things that I write about.
Yeah, fantastic. And I was going to ask a bit about that the beginning of your career, like how you went from, or even now as a lawyer, but how did you dabble into the books yourself? Do you mind going into that journey, how you got into being an author?
Yeah, I certainly never imagined that I'd be an author. I never imagined that I could write. I mean, law students are trained to write, but not in a way that most people would care to read. But I guess where I got to was we had 4 kids under the age of 9, and then my wife rather considerately announced that she was pregnant with twins.
Oh, nice.
And that we'd have twin babies to add to that mix. And I wasn't coping with the 4 we had, let alone twin babies, particularly given that Lizzie, my wife, is very, very definite about the need to breastfeed children until they're 12 months of age.
Yeah.
And doing that with twins meant she was basically not going to be available to help for 2 months. That's right. And so I was a good 40 kilos of weight at that time. I'd managed to accumulate that weight pretty steadily during my life. And I was feeling not much up to it all. And I'd tried most for losing weight. I saw a diet on television. Keto, low carb, you name it. I tried it. And they all worked. They all worked for exactly as my willpower would hold out, which was generally about 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks, I'd lose a couple of kilos, and the willpower would give out, and I'd stop doing it, and the weight would usually come back, usually with some interest for good measure. Now, I didn't accept that somehow there was a mass failure of willpower responsible for not my weight gain, but everybody else's. And I thought that perhaps the science had better answers than that. And so I decided to employ the research skills that I'd been trained with in law. At the time, this is when I was doing this was early 2003, 2004, close to the birth of the internet. And large online medical libraries were going to become available, where you could cross-index research. So you'd see things from neurologists and nutritionists and so on, and you could cross-match that research on the internet. And so I started doing that. Came to the conclusion that we'd told a load of old cobblers about what made us fat and what made us thin, and that the real answer appeared to be that it was a fairly simple recipe, which was that the fructose half of sugar, so sugar, table sugar, half glucose, half fructose, the fructose half is an unnatural addition to our diet. In its natural state, we only encounter it in fresh fruit and if we can get past the bees, in honey. And that amounts to about, for the average human pre the industrial age, about 2 teaspoons worth of sugar a day. Wow. And now I saw stats that showed that we were now consuming those 2 teaspoons of sugar a day plus 40 teaspoons of added sugar.
Oh my gosh.
I thought, well, that's probably going to have an effect. And I started to discover that there was good research from the 50s, 60s, 70s showing not only does it have an effect, but eliminating it should reverse all of that effect. And I thought, well, this is to put to the test. Just stop eating fructose. Easier said than done, is long story short, but I did it. 40 weeks, lost 40 kilos. I've
40 kilos.
Dropped to the weight I am now and stayed that way ever since. And done nothing special other than just not eating things with fructose in. So what does that look like in real life? Well, it still means you can have a pie and chips. It just means you can't put sauce on it because it's full of sugar. Now, obviously when you lose 40 kilos, people notice. And one of my business partners at the time noticed he's quite keen on it, and he'd heard me explain it to people quite a lot, people who asked and said, well, what on earth did you do? And tell that story to them. And he said, you really just got to write all this down and explain to people what you found and what you did and how to do it. And he said, do that and I'll sell it to a publisher. And I said, well, you don't know any publishers, so good luck with that. He said, you write it, I'll sell it. And a year later, so I wrote him a thing. I wrote it like a lawyer, and my wife read it and said, that's a load of garbage. Don't you dare write like that. Write the way you speak. So I essentially wrote it all in one go. Gave it to my partner, Frank. He's mentioned in the acknowledgements of every book I've written, and forgot about it. And a year later, he called me up and said, listen, I've got you a meeting with a publisher from Penguin. You need to get yourself on a plane down to Melbourne tomorrow and meet with them. So I did that. And as the rest is history, the publisher liked it. She published the book, probably against the advice of many in her publishing house. And I've stuck with her ever since. She's published every book I've had ever since.
That's amazing. And it's just like a walking billboard, right?
That's right.
Unbelievable. So, and I was trying to think of with the amount of kids you have kids you have now, and also being a lawyer, how did you find the time to research all that stuff? I know it would have been a passion, I suppose, and I guess to lose weight and you saw results.
Some people play golf. My hobby is researching stuff.
Yeah, well, okay. Yeah, great. Well, I know my wife's read it, and she just went on a complete, she goes, no, I'm going to own my own body now. I'm going to own my own dietary stuff. And she was putting all up signs up around the place and that kind of stuff. And absolutely love that book. But then I don't know how he came across Teen Brain, and but I remember coming across it. Might be just the cover, and I was talking about technology, and I realised that being a current teacher at the moment, it was very hard to get the kids off the screens. And it might have been only maybe 2 or 3 years ago that I read it, and it was just like I could not put it down. And I was thinking about it before, where I'd drop the kids off at gymnastics, and I'd go to a cafe for an hour, and I'd read it and then write notes on a piece of paper. Then I'd take the kids on holidays and then come back, and while I'm at the massive laundromat, because we got 5 kids between us, I was at the laundromat writing down quotes that you'd had, and I'd take screenshots and send it to some parents I knew, other staff members, and I couldn't put it down. And it dead set changed my life with teaching. I don't mean that lightly, with teaching, but also the way we parent our kids. So,
that's great. I'm glad it's having an effect.
It's massive, but I mean, I'm in charge of the wellbeing at our college, so looking after the student wellbeing and some of the staff. But you know, you get a lot of obviously pushback and things like that. But if you don't mind, we'll go into teen brain, and obviously
Sure.
I'm definitely keen to look at sweet poison and obviously advocate that to our students and ourselves as well. But with teen brain, who's the audience and what's the real message?
Teen brain, well, the audience it's mostly aimed at parents of teenagers. Although, you know, teenagers can read it too. My teenagers have read it, and I know, you know, quite a lot of kids do actually read it themselves. It's for the inquiring mind, if you like, people who want to understand how the piece of hardware they're equipped with actually works, and how to control some of the outcomes associated with using that hardware in today's society.
Yeah, okay.
So it's both. It's both parents. I mean, primarily parents. It's the language. It's aimed at parents, but certainly teenagers can read it too.
And with Teen Brain, what inspired you to do that book in particular, to write about technology?
Well, at the time, I was the parent of 6 teenagers.
Yeah, wow.
And, you know, my oldest, Anthony, is now 29, and he was right at the cutting edge of devices in schools. So when the iPad was released, I think that was when he was in year 9 or 10 at high school. And so I was able to see what school looked like before there were devices in schools, and see that transition over to, by the time my youngest left school, you know, a couple of years ago, where it was just absolute saturation. You know, every child had an iPad, every child had at least one phone. You know, it was just total saturation. And it was really obvious to me that there was a real change going on. And it was much more, it felt, honestly though, I didn't want to write Teen Brain. I didn't, when I first started looking, it was an idea pitched to me by my publisher, who said, you know, I have a lot of, so she's a similar age to me. She said, I have a lot of friends who are really worried about their kids and devices. And, you know, I think it'd be really useful if you dug into that and looked at what does the science say about this. And I said, you know, I thought I knew what the science would say. I thought what I would find is that there was nothing special. It was just, you know, parents bleating on about kids these days the way every generation does. But the more I read into it, and the more I understood it, and the more I observed the way it affected not only my kids, but friends' kids and so on, the more I became convinced, no, that's not what's going on here at all. There is something very, very different going on, and very, very dangerous. And so it went from a book I didn't want to write, that I didn't think needed to be written, to a book that, you know, desperately needs to be out there.
Oh, 100%. And I mean, I was reading it too, and you were talking about, you know, stereotypically boys are addicted to games because of the risk and the testosterone and things like that, and the girls mainly with social media. And I'll guarantee I'll go to a class and say, you know, hand up if you're on gaming, hand up social media, and it's always about 9% for each one, like the way you've explained it. Do you mind just for people who are listening to just explain a bit about the neuro behind the screen addiction? Like, I know you talked about dopamine, serotonin, delta phos B, GABA. Is there like is it like a real, like a simple way to put that across? So if people are listening to this going, well, you know, how does it affect your neurotransmitters, or how does it actually give you addiction?
Okay. Let's give it a go.
Yeah, great.
It's a complex area, but let's try simplifying it.
Thank you.
So in order for us to do anything, we have to be motivated to do it. So this is probably best explained by what happens when we're not. There's been some interesting experiments done with lab rats where they disconnect the dopamine receptors in the rat's brain. And the rat is starving, really, really, really hungry, but they disconnect the dopamine receptors and put food like a centimetre away from the rat. And the rat does not move to get the food because the dopamine receptors are disconnected. in order to motivate us to move, to chase a reward, in that case the food, we require dopamine. And so that's its primary function in our brain, is to make us chase reward. So we're hardwired, just like most animals, for things that will ensure the procreation of the species. So we will always chase food. We will always chase sex. We will always, this is one particular to humans, chase the company of other humans. I'll explain that one in a little bit more detail, but those ones are hardwired in humans. Food, sex, company of other humans. And there's another one that's hardwired, which doesn't sound like it's the same, but is, which is that we'll always run away from danger. Now, that sounds like it's the opposite to chasing something. That sounds like it's making you go in the other direction. How can one hormone make both things happen? If you think about run away from danger as run towards safety, then it makes sense. So it is food, sex, safety, company of other humans. So that's what dopamine makes us do, and that's the normal function. Without it, we'd be stuffed. There might have been humans once who didn't have it, but they would have lasted only one generation.
Now I have to cut you off there for a second. There's an issue we've got with this podcast already. I feel like I'm writing down notes from what you're saying, and it's so good. It's so good. That makes sense. Sorry, keep going. I understand that so far. So we chase dopamine for reward. Yep. Now,
that's all well and good as long as nothing wrecks our dopamine system. Now, our dopamine system has an adjustment control, and I don't know if you've probably experienced this. So, for example, we have a sort of an adjustment for smell, for example. So, if we were to walk into a room where there was a horrific smell, and as soon as we walked in, we go, "Oh, that's awful!" But someone said, "You've got to stay in there and tell me when this other smell happens in that room." Your brain would adjust within about 10 minutes and screen out the existing smell. So you wouldn't smell it at all, which is why people who don't use deodorant, by the way, have no problems with the way they smell, because they smell it all the time. And so they're screening it out. Now, if you walked back outside that room and then waited 10 minutes and then walked back in, you'd smell it again. So that's our brain using what's called an epigenetic switch, which is that it turns off the sensors, and the reason it's doing that is to screen out background noise, screen out background smell, screen out background light, so that we notice changes. Because essential to our survival in the wild is noticing changes in our environment. So we adjust. Now, we have one of those for dopamine as well. And it's called delta phos B, but you don't need to remember the name. It's it's our epigenetic switch for screening out dopamine. You'd say, well, why on earth would you need a dopamine screen? Well, if we think about one example, for example, the one I said before about running away from danger towards safety, what if the environment you're in is dangerous all the time? What if there is danger around you all the time, but most of it is sort of a low-level danger with occasional spikes in danger? What if you're in a jungle where anything could get you at any time, but you've got to really notice if there's a tiger coming? So we screen out the dopamine stimulation that all that danger is constantly giving us, making us run towards safety, so that we can pay attention to the really dangerous stuff. Now, you see this in wartime, for example, with humans. So a human that's living in a war zone where there are explosions going off all around will pay no regard really to most of them and only react to something that's really close and really dangerous. Whereas a human living, say, somewhere like Scarborough might pay attention to any explosion.
That's right. Yeah, that would be me.
Any explosion is a bad thing. Whereas that same person in a war zone was not going to care about 10 explosions that are more than a kilometre away, but will care about the one that's 10 metres away. So that's how that works. So we have a dopamine tolerance thing, if you like,
Yeah.
that screens out the dopamine, which means that we can get higher and higher hits of dopamine without us making us react. And the same thing works on the reward side as well too. If you're in an environment where there's constant supply of food, then you don't want to really pay attention to all of the food all of the time. You don't want to be racing about trying to fill your mouth all the time with food. You only want to get the stuff that's really valuable and really stimulating. And so you need to filter out there as well. So, all right, so we have that switching mechanism that works that way. And that all is great too, because, we might move environments where it's not so much food available and then we need to adjust. And so delta phos B adjusts back down, just like that thing about walking out of the room with the smell. The problem is, though, the delta phos B takes a long time to adjust. Smell, it's about 10 minutes, the epigenetic switch. With dopamine, delta phos B takes about 3 months to adjust back to normal.
Wow.
So it isn't a quick adjustment. There's probably really good evolutionary reasons for that. I can't think what they might be, but it isn't a quick one. Now, what has all this got to do with anything to do with the device? You might well be asking by now.
No, this is good. I'm actually thinking about things like, no wonder, I guess things like, I'm trying to put those two together where, dopamine will chase reward, and one of those things is sex. I'm guessing that's why dating apps, Tinder, that kind of stuff is huge now, massive, because it's just, it's one of the primal things, I suppose, but also dopamine chase reward.
But you don't even have to be that sophisticated. So there's ways to artificially stimulate dopamine, and humans are pretty good at, dopamine feels good, right? So we're pretty good at designing ways to artificially stimulate dopamine. We pretty quickly discovered that alcohol did that. And so we, whenever we get a chance to, we'll artificially stimulate some dopamine with a substance like alcohol. Now, that's the most commonly occurring one, but, by the 60s, 70s, 80s, we discovered there were a lot of substances that could artificially stimulate dopamine, like nicotine, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, a whole lot of opioid drugs, all artificially stimulate dopamine. And we thought, well, that's a good thing. Now, the problem with this is that we like stimulating dopamine, and the more we stimulate it, the more we need to stimulate it, because remember that tolerance is going up and up and up as if you're in a war zone, which is that, every time you take the hit of extra dopamine, the level you need to get to feel good next time is higher. And we call that addiction. There's a bunch of substances that behave that way. And we know this because some really interesting experiments that were done on human subjects in the 1970s that probably wouldn't be allowed to be done today. But what they did was they implanted electrodes in these people's brains that stimulated the dopamine centers. And they gave them a device that allowed them to press a button that would give them a dopamine stimulation. And they said, they gave no parameters to this. They just said, press the button, see what happens. They do it. They got a shot of dopamine. They said, oh, that's not too bad. And then they press it again, and they get another, and then they press it again. They were pressing it 300 times an hour by the end of the experiment.
Oh, my God.
They were pleading with the experimenters to take the switch away from them, but they could not put it down themselves. They couldn't. Does that sound like something? That sounds to me like something that stimulates dopamine. It sounds like an addict. And that's exactly what they'd done. They'd created an addict by simply artificially stimulating dopamine. And that's what we do with substances. Now, up until very recently, pretty much the only way to do it was have access to alcohol or some of these illicit substances if you wanted to artificially stimulate dopamine. There were other ways, but even they weren't that easy to come by, because, you see, our brain also will work just fine on a simulation of a real dopamine stimulant. So any 12-year-old boy who's ever, looked at a nudie picture of a girl will tell you that it's stimulating. So the brain, now that's not real, it's a picture. But the brain says close enough, I'll take that, and you'll get a dopamine hit, and hence the foundation of the pornography industry. But even there, until about the early 2000s, pornography wasn't that easy to come by if you were a teenage boy.
Yeah.
You'd have to have an encounter with the local newsagent,
Be sneaky, wouldn't you?
get through the sealed section of the Playboy. There was no internet. There was no way to be generally having access to that sort of thing. And so whilst for the adventurous few, getting drugs, getting alcohol, getting access to porn was possible, it wasn't easy.
Yep.
We've changed that. We've now given every teenager a device that they can carry around in their pocket that accesses every piece of pornography ever made in the world ever for free, whenever they want. So we've given them a device that's very much like that device those people in the experiment had, which is you want to hit a dopamine, press this button.
Yeah.
Same thing going on there. Now, so we've taken what was pretty rare, pretty hard to come by, and required you to ingest something and turned it into something that you just have to see to get the same result, and given it to every child. That's a pretty bizarre thing to do, but we've gone much further than that because it's easy to understand with pornography because that's playing off one of the primal urges, right, which is the desire for sex. So you say, okay, we're just piggybacking on that, and that should work. If we wanted to make something that caused people to be addicted, then we find a primal urge and we piggyback off that.
Yeah.
So sex and porn, easy. What if you want to sell stuff that's a little bit more PG rated? It's not, if you're Facebook, you can't get away with selling porn, right? So you've got to come up with some other thing to piggyback the dopamine hit on. And what they discovered, almost by accident, was there's a different dopamine stimulant that's built into humans. And that's that other one I mentioned before, the fourth one, which is we like the company of other humans. Yeah. It's a little bit more than like. It's actually the secret to our dominance of this planet. So if you think about us, humans are the dominant predator on this planet. But if you think about dominant predators, we shouldn't be, really. We have no horns. We've got no venom. We've got no scales. In fact, we're pretty crap as predators go, and we'd be lunch for a crocodile or a great white or anything else. Yeah. So why aren't we? What saves us? What saves us is we're the only species that cooperates with strangers. So humans uniquely can cooperate with strangers because we trust strangers. Why do we trust strangers? Because we are wired by something called oxytocin to please other humans. Yes. So we, in groups, will do what the group wants to cooperate with what the group's aims are. And we get reward from that. We feel good when other humans tell us they like what we are doing. So once you understand that mechanism, suddenly there's a recipe to make money. Yeah. Because if you can simulate that in the same way that pornography simulates sex, then you've got something that can be addictive. And that's exactly what Facebook, Instagram, all the other social media are. They've found a way to do a high-speed simulation of doing things that other people communicate to you that they like. In other words, putting a like button on something that you post. Yeah. That is piggybacking on the oxytocin thing. And you pointed out before, but that only seems to affect girls, doesn't seem to affect the boys. And the answer to that is there's a really good reason for that, and there's a really good reason for it in teenage years. Boys have a huge surge in testosterone in their teenage years. Testosterone suppresses oxytocin, which is why boys don't care about social media and they don't care what other people think of them either. Because testosterone suppresses oxytocin. They don't care what other people think. Now, that changes by the time they're in their 20s, but the prime years are from the start of puberty for about 10 years when that testosterone surge suppresses the oxytocin. So that's why girls like social media and boys don't really can take it or leave it. Because to them, there's nothing particularly addictive about doing things that other people like. But the other thing you said is, well, what about games? Because the boys do like the games. Well, that's the other side of the coin, which is if you think about what a game is, it's a simulation of a near-death experience.
Yeah.
or a death experience. Most games involve your first-person shooter character dying 300 or 400 times a day.
Yeah.
In other words, you are put in a situation simulating real danger. Now, remember I said before that if you're in an environment of real danger, you'll be getting dopamine hits just as frequently as someone who's in an environment of real pleasure, because you have that dopamine hit forcing you to run to safety. That is what what makes gaming addictive. By the way, it's exactly the same thing with gambling. Gambling, the risk of losing money, is a risk which causes chronic stress, which is the same thing, the run to safety. So gambling, gaming, same thing. More effect on boys who are more stimulated by things which drive testosterone. So testosterone drives boys to do dangerous things, which is why boys are much more likely to be injured in their teen years, much more likely to die in their teen years, because they have less impulse control because of their testosterone. They care less about what other people think of them, and they're driven to do dangerous things. So their risk assessment of a situation is clouded by the testosterone, where a girl would look at the same situation and say, I'm not doing that, that's dangerous. A boy would say, you're insane, it's fine.
I don't care.
So they desire danger. They seek danger, and gaming gives them a high-speed simulation of danger, which is addictive.
Right. And with that point then, but isn't it part of your book too where you say that a lot of times our young boys will do something, say act in a poor way to get credibility from their mates from older boys? Like is it also a way to where I guess that social impact does affect the guys?
Yes and no. Boys, it's more of a hierarchical pack nature. So it's not about acceptance. It's about control. It's about recognizing who the alpha in the group is and pulling in behind that. It's a similar thing. I'm not saying boys don't operate on oxytocin. They do. Yeah. They very much do. They're just very much less affected by it, by what a stranger thinks of them, and more affected, like all of us, boy or girl, are affected by what someone we know thinks of us.
Right. Okay.
Because they are much less affected than a girl, girls care what strangers think. Boys couldn't care less what a stranger thinks.
Right, okay.
But they both care what someone they know thinks.
Yeah. Okay, I get it. Right, so then if we talked about delta phos B and the dopamine, and that's like, again, I'm writing down notes where you're talking to me like a bit of a nerd, like a stereotypical nerd here. So how does it come in place where, like I know you talk about serotonin and GABA, and is there, what are the things then that causes anxiety and or depression based on those levels? Like, can you pinpoint those?
Okay, all right. So first of all, the relationship to GABA. So GABA, G-A-B-A, is a hormone that's turned off to start puberty. So in order for us to enter puberty, the thing that stops us entering puberty the moment we're born is GABA. Okay. So it keeps the puberty switch turned off until we are at a physical state where it can be enacted. And quite a lot of things happen during puberty. The last bit of our brain is built. So the last quarter of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, is built after puberty starts. And part of what allows that to happen is GABA being turned off. Now, GABA, unfortunately, isn't just a suppressor of puberty starting. It's a general purpose suppressor of stuff. The body likes to get good use out of things. And it is also used to suppress dopamine. So it's a way of blunting the effect of dopamine, of stopping us get to the point where too much dopamine is coming into the system and we're becoming addicted. So before puberty and after puberty, we are much harder to addict because of GABA. Right. So children are harder to addict, adults are harder to addict, but there's that 10 years from the start of puberty to the early 20s when we are easy to addict, because the control mechanism that stops us becoming addicted is turned off to allow puberty to happen. Right. And that's why all the research says addiction starts in your teens. Right. There's no psychology mumbo-jumbo explanation for that. It's a simple biochemical one. The thing that stops you becoming addicted is turned off during that period. That's why teenagers are when people become addicts.
Right.
With alcohol, by the way, just as a footnote to that, it's an especially dangerous addictive substance because the body, because it simulates GABA. So alcohol has a double effect. It's a stimulant at first, and then it's a depressant. And that depressant effect is it simulating GABA. So the body actually thinks that the alcohol is the GABA and stops producing its own. And if you drink enough alcohol during your teenage years, then the body will never be able to produce sufficient GABA, and you will never be able to not be an addict.
Wow.
So it's a special case. Not all drugs are like that one, but alcohol is a special case. I've completely forgotten the point of the question. Yes. We're talking about your teenage years.
Yeah. So
go ahead.
So you're going to say was also one where you said that alcohol is the only drug or substance that gives you dopamine and serotonin at the same time? Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, because it's that double effect. So initially, at the initial phases of drinking, it's a stimulant. So it decreases inhibition. It acts like cocaine. It gets you up and dancing, right? But it then turns into a depressant as it starts to simulate GABA and get into the system, and GABA shuts down the system, and so that's what puts you to sleep. Because teenagers have less GABA anyway, so it's a cumulative effect, right? So in an adult, you'll be asleep, after your sixth drink, right?
Yeah.
Teenager won't, because they don't have as much GABA in the underlying system, so they can keep on drinking way past the point where they're paralytic and they should be asleep, and an adult would be asleep, they're not, which is why alcohol is particularly dangerous for teenagers.
Yeah, scary. So then what's the link then between people who, so let's go back to screen addiction, and they've got all the dopamine running through their brains and obviously affecting their delta phos B. What then with the if you talk about dopamine levels, what becomes someone like anxious or depressed? Is it clear cut? Is it a clear cut?
It is. Well, it's relatively clear cut.
Yeah.
So one of the things that happens is as delta phos B gets higher and higher and higher, it changes some other things about the way our brain works. So one of the things that delta phos B does is affect our risk assessment. So the higher it gets, the more our risk assessment calculations. So it's actually a fairly mathematical system that we use, which is a delta of risk. So remember I said before that a boy and a girl will look at the same situation and the boy will say there's no risk there and the girl will say you're kidding me, that's deadly. That's a difference in risk assessment. Now you might say, well, then why has the boy got such an out of whack higher level of risk assessment? Because testosterone pushes delta phos B up as a base level. So boys have as a base level a higher level of delta phos B and a higher need for stimulation than a girl.
Right.
The interesting thing is that as that gets higher and higher, as you get into addiction territory, your risk assessments get completely out of whack, so that you start to worry about things that normally, if you were not an addict or were not having your delta phos B affected, you wouldn't have no concerns at all. But a person who has a high delta phos B has an extremely high and incorrect assessment of environmental risk. So you'll look at a situation, an addict will look at the same situation, they'll say that's terrifying, there's too much risk there, there's danger to me in that environment, whereas you will say, I don't know what you're talking about, this is perfect normal, this is the way it's always been. So it messes with your risk assessment. If you're worried about the dangers in your environment all the time, it's what is generally regarded as anxiety. So the other side of that is disappointment. If you are expecting a reward of X and you don't quite get X, now remembering that the expectation is set by delta phos B as well. So you've got a high delta phos B level, it's expecting a high dopamine hit, but you do not get sufficient dopamine to get that level. So for whatever reason, you thought you were going to get 1,000 likes, you got two likes. It's a disappointment. You don't get as many dopamine hits. Remembering every like on your Instagram post gives you a little dopamine hit through oxytocin. You experience disappointment. We have another word for disappointment. Well, doctors have another word for disappointment. It's called depression.
Right.
Depression is a mismatch between expectation and reality. And so what's occurring there is as delta phos B goes higher and higher and higher, you are more likely to be anxious about your environment and you are more likely to be disappointed by everything. The
Mm.
combination of those two things together is what we call anxiety and depression. They co-occur almost all the time, and that's because they're caused by the same thing, which is delta phos B being too high. Why is delta phos B too high? Because you're exposed to addiction or danger or both. So that's how those things are linked. Now, that goes into another spectrum of disease as well. So dopamine being too low as measured by delta phos B, remember delta phos B is saying how much dopamine your brain thinks you need. And if whatever you're doing is not giving you that much dopamine, then you have insufficient dopamine. Unfortunately, dopamine, besides doing all this, remember I said the brain likes to get multiple uses out of things.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing dopamine does is give us focus.
Right.
It gives us focus. So as delta phos B gets higher and higher and higher, our attention span gets shorter and shorter and shorter, and our ability to focus gets less and less and less. And typically that's diagnosed as ADHD. By the way, the cure for ADHD is to give someone an amphetamine, which is a stimulant, to get the dopamine levels up to the level that delta phos B says they need. So the way to calm down an ADHD person is to put them on a stimulant drug to get their dopamine levels up.
That's amazing.
It's also very temporary. It'll work for the few hours that the stimulant works, and then they're back to where they were. And probably made the problem worse by pushing delta phos B yet higher. The other thing that happens is that once delta phos B reaches really extreme heights, not only do you become anxious about your environment, you become paranoid about the intentions of other humans. So you start to seriously overestimate the risk of other humans. And if you get to the point where that is at an extreme level, it's what's called a psychotic break, where you believe that every other human is out to get you. And if you have enough psychotic breaks in a row, you'll be diagnosed as a schizophrenic. So this is all part of a continuum, and it all has at its root a failure of delta phos B being too high. How did delta phos B get too high? We overstimulated it, just like those people with the button.
So, and I guess, again, simplicity, is this the problems with behaviours in schools? Or, we just talked earlier on about, we always blame generations, or, it wasn't like that for us, or all those kind of cliches. But is this the problem we have? A lot of times we have problems in schools because, like you said, all these things about the boys, they need to have that overstimulation, but it's not enough. The subjects are enough, or the teacher's not engaging enough.
The problem is that you've now got school classrooms full of kids who are handed a dopamine button when they're 3 years old and have been using it ever since. And by the time they're teenagers, they are full-blown addicts. They are not necessarily addicted to cocaine, although it's starting to transfer to a substance abuse now. You'll see with the increased use of vapes. Yeah. But these people are addicts. There's no other way to describe it. You have classrooms full of addicts. Yeah. And what comes with that is anxiety, depression, ADHD, and ultimately psychosis and schizophrenia. So they are different kids that you're teaching these days. I talk to schools. I've done this talk to schools many, many times, and you'll often have an older teacher put up their hand at the end when I ask for questions, and they'll say, I'm not imagining it. When I first started teaching 30 years ago, I had maybe one ADHD kid in every 3 classes I ever did. Now I've got 5 in every class. And no teacher you speak to would say that's an exaggeration. And that makes a lot of classroom behavior mostly about controlling that rather than teaching. And we have created that rod for our own back because we've required every child in every classroom to have a device that delivers dopamine hits constantly.
So David, does that mean that, can you get the same overstimulation from a laptop, or does gaming give you more than social media? Do we know the differences between the platforms?
No, well, it depends whether you're male or female. So the effect is the same, though. If you want to know whether someone is an addict, take the thing away from them and see how they behave. That's the simple test. if I wanted to know whether you were an alcoholic, if I took all the alcohol out of your house and banned it ever getting in, I'd be able to tell pretty quickly whether you're an alcoholic by the way you behaved.
Yeah.
It's the same with anything else. If someone says to me, I'm not addicted to social media, I say, great, delete your account.
That's right.
If they can just do that, they're not. They were right.
Yeah, that's right. But what about
Most
things
people
like?
can't.
But what about things people like I have a lot of students who talk about how they're completely addicted to series shows on Netflix, for example. Like,
but that's that's a different level of addiction. So, and I talk about this a little bit in the book. They're trying, God bless them. I mean, if they could be as addictive as social media, they would be.
Yeah.
But they're limited by the media. But they are trying. The interesting thing is they're getting more sophisticated about it. So when you watch something on YouTube or on Netflix or whatever, it's not like watching television. When you're watching Netflix or YouTube, it's watching you too.
Yeah.
It knows what you watch, how long you watch it. If you're doing it on a phone, it's probably monitoring even where your eyes are looking, how long you stay focused on the screen, what volume you have it at, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they're paying close attention, and all of that is going into an algorithm which determines what to show you next.
Right.
That can be mildly addictive. It's nowhere near as powerful because the environment is not as powerful as something like social media or gaming, but they're trying their best.
Yeah. Do you think, here's a bit of a generalised question, do you think parents are aware of the dangers of technology addiction?
No, because I think most parents think, well, there's two things. First of all, most parents would rather pretend the problem didn't exist because they don't want to have to deal with taking the device away from their kid.
Yeah.
Because they've probably tried that at some point and seen the outcome, and they are not at all keen for a rerun. And I know that because I've been there. And the second thing is that they probably justify that to themselves by saying, it's just, it's kids these days. This is what the kids are into. You're making a big deal out of nothing. It's not nothing. Yeah. This is genuinely as addictive as any addictive substance, and we are letting our children access it 24 hours a day.
So a lot of our kids' dopamine systems are broken.
Absolutely.
Can they be reversed?
Yeah, they can. The same way you reverse any. People say, "Oh, how do I break these addictions?" Well, the same way you break any addiction. You stop exposing yourself to the dopamine stimulation, and then 3 months later, you'll be fine.
Yeah, 3 months. Remember you saying that 3 months earlier. So in my brain, I was thinking, so it's going to take people 3 months to detox, really.
Yeah, that's the way any addiction is broken. It doesn't matter what it is, and don't let anyone ever tell you any different. There is no magic way to lower delta phos-B other than give it 3 months to reset.
So is that your advice to people?
And then don't expose yourself to massive amounts of dopamine straight afterwards.
Yeah, right. And so that's the answer to technology addiction then? It's just basically remove it?
Yeah, remove it.
So I know on a personal level, like when I was reading your book, I had a bit of a fun podcast recently just saying that I used to take my daughter to rugby league and she was only young and, back then had no idea, took the iPad. iPad must have been just invented. And I remember going to the pre-game and by the time we started, gave her some chips and an ice block or whatever and she's like, how much longer to go, Dad? And I said, well, it's just started. We've got 73 minutes to go. And she goes, all right, give me the iPad. And I'd give her the iPad and she'd be quiet and I'd be watching the footy. It's great. And then when I listened to...
Yeah, it's an electronic babysitter. It's setting 100%. Your kids to stun.
So when I read your book and I was saying to Rachel and sending this stuff, I said, look, between us, we've got 5 kids. I know too much now. We can't put them on it. And so our kids are 14, 13, 12, almost 12 again. So all girls, older boys 21. They don't have social media, and we look like we are the strangest people in the world when people talk to us at school. We talk to other parents. They're like, "How do you do that?" And I was like, "I just know too much. I've read this book. I know too much." Are we the weird ones out there? Like, is like we actually don't
increasingly not. There's a lot of parents thinking the way you are. There's a lot of parents taking it seriously, and as I say about every book I write, you will have seen the footnotes in that book. I mean, the back third of the book is science, is references to studies. And that's because I don't expect anyone to believe a word I am saying. I am a lawyer, for God's sake.
Stop it.
I am not a biochemist. So I don't want you to believe me. I'm just giving you a summary of what it says.
Yeah.
If you want to read it for yourself, the references are there. This is all well settled science. There's nothing magical about any of this. This is not some sort of weird, cult or something. This is just what the science says, and you either believe it or don't believe it, but it doesn't change what it says.
No, and that's right. And so you talked about brain, and you obviously read the book Brain Reset. I was going to ask a question, but I think you might have already answered it already, saying, is the addiction still the same for teens and parents? And you said no, because, the system gets switched off. But there's still a lot of parents out there who are addicted, aren't
and
there?
that's one thing. There are, but more mildly.
Okay.
And this is part of the problem, is that unless you grew up with these devices and apps as part of your life from when you started puberty, you don't really understand this. I mean, I remember growing up playing video games and so on, but that's not the same experience that a child is having today. Those games were algorithmic. I was playing against a machine. I would eventually learn the patterns. I would eventually beat it. I'd eventually be over it.
Yeah.
That's not what these kids are experiencing now. They're playing against humans and sometimes bots, but they're different every single time. Every single time is a new you can't learn a pattern. You can't get over it. It's designed to addict, and it works brilliantly. So parents think they understand it from their own experience of these things and say, well, I got over it, they'll get over it. No, they can't get over it. It's a very, very different thing that they're experiencing. So that doesn't, it makes it harder for parents to understand that this is different now. That the world they grew up in changed significantly in 2011 when the iPad was released. And I'm blaming the iPad, choose your own brand, but it was the first one.
Yeah.
And it was only 13 years ago. It feels like the world has always been this way, but it was only 13 years ago. And anyone who's that age, who's had that in their life their whole time, has had a very different life to anyone else who's ever lived on this planet, in that they've been exposed to addiction all the time.
So is there a safe way that parents can say, I guess everyone's different with their own neural pathways, but is it safe to say, if it's monitored, you can have social media for 2 or 3 hours a day? Or is it best saying...
Oh, yeah, look, it's just like, it's like, if you had a kid who was an alcoholic, you'd let them have, a couple of shots of vodka every night, as long as they weren't drinking all day, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing. We're talking about addiction. It doesn't change because it's on a device and it's not a substance. It's addiction. It's the same thing. You have to treat it the same. You are either doing it or you're not doing it, and it's that simple. One thing I would suggest, though, is that there are alternative sources of dopamine which are much more wholesome and which can help you come down and bring delta phos B down.
Can you please share? That'd be great. Yes.
Yeah. So one of them is playing a musical instrument.
Mm-hmm.
If you are fortunate enough to have a child who is good at a musical instrument, you have to be good at it to get value out of this, which means because it puts them into a state of flow, that the amount of focus required to play a musical instrument well is extreme. In order to have that focus, you have to have large amounts of dopamine being generated in your brain. It is a counteraction to the low dopamine levels. It will not be enough to make them addicted to playing music unless they are very extreme about it. But you will notice a kid that you have to drag kicking and screaming to do a practice, but then when they finish the practice, they're happy like they've just had a party. They're people who are getting a dopamine hit out of doing that. Find that activity for your kid. For some kids, it'll be music. For some kids, it'll be solving maths problems. For some kids, it'll be running around on a footy field. But find that activity that makes them focus enough to generate their own dopamine.
So it needs time and focus, basically, to slow them down, but also to earn it, not just to get instant gratification.
To something that will preferably take them about an hour to do, that requires them to be absolutely focused while they are doing it.
Okay. All right, I've got 2 more toughies for you. Well, it's not tough for you, but two more questions for you. do you think that technology is affecting our society, such as, I don't know, lack of empathy, desensitization? What's your thoughts around that?
Probably not in that sense. It is affecting us in the sense that we have a society that is mostly addicted now, which means people have lower impulse control, are more likely to be anxious, are more likely to be depressed, are more likely to be ADHD, and have difficulty focusing.
Mm-hmm.
So we've gone from a society where that was fairly unusual to now a society where every second person you see has those issues, where a large number of the kids in every classroom have those issues. And that makes society in general much more rough terrain for people to deal with than it would be where people are cooperating and have reasonable self-control and reasonable levels of anxiety and are not depressed.
Okay, now you've got me given another question here. So what's the secret to a good school these days then? Is there some, I know in your book you talked about 4 or 5
a great start. Yeah, a great start would be no devices in classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
No phones, no hotspotting, no devices, no iPads. And people say, I don't want my kids going to some Stone Age school. They've got to learn how to use a computer. Great. Have a school, have a computer lab. Treat computers like tools, not toys.
Oh, I like that.
You go to a classroom that's full of computers, you learn how to use a computer, you leave. It's not yours. It's not yours to take home on the bus and watch porn on. Yep. It is a tool. End of story.
So back to pen and paper.
Well, I know, sure, if that's what it takes in the classroom, but why wouldn't you do that?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I mean, there's really some really interesting research. I didn't put it in the books, but I noticed it. Is that you actually learn better because of if you handwrite something rather than type it, because of the micro movement skills that are required in writing. Actually do give a better imprint on the brain.
Yeah, there you go. All right, so that's a good start for schools.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts of the recent proposed, the censorship rules about not allowing our teens onto technology till they're 16? Will it work? Will it go through?
Look, what's that old saying about locks? As soon as you invent a better lock, someone will invent a better way to break it.
Yeah.
We've theoretically had that around pornography forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you really believe it's working? Do you really believe that no one under the age of 18 is viewing pornography on their phone? I struggle to believe that. And I don't think it's any more likely to be true about social media either.
Mm. So it does come back to the parent responsibility, right? End of the day.
Just don't have the device there. It's like saying, you know what? What I'm going to do is I'm going to keep a fridge full of vodka in the lounge room, and I'm just going to trust my kids not to access it.
Mm.
It's like giving a kid a chainsaw and expecting them to build a cubby house with it. You can't ask someone who has GABA shut down and access to unlimited dopamine to exercise self-control. If they could exercise self-control, there'd be no such thing as an addict.
Mm.
It's just the definition of addict is no self-control.
No. And I was just, as you're saying that again with the GABA levels, I was just trying to think, how do we slow down, and particularly then our teenage boys in classrooms?
Well, you have to recognize the difference for starters. Like, you have to recognize that the boys are largely kinetic learners, or that they're going to find learning easier if it involves some physical movement, because they are full of testosterone driving them to do exactly that.
Mm.
And it's worth noting, I think there's a graph in one of those books, probably Teen Brain, where I actually chart the levels of testosterone in males and females. And, females have some testosterone as well, very, very small relative to males. But if you compare, say, even a teenage, like a 13-year-old boy to a 28-year-old male, the 28-year-old's operating on about half as much testosterone as the 13-year-old boy.
Yeah.
But the 28-year-old doesn't take that into account in dealing with the 14-year-old boy.
Yeah.
You know, but it has a significant effect on them. They have zero impulse control. They will do the most risky thing. They have no ability to assess risk. So these are things you need to take into account when dealing with people who are hyped up on testosterone.
Mm. Yeah, and obviously being addicts too, and the delta phosphors are out of whack.
Well, that's even worse. That just magnifies it.
Yeah, crazy. Crazy. Well, look, I could talk to you all night. This is great. This is unbelievable. So I really appreciate all the facts and the information and the insights you've provided tonight. And I'm sure there's going to be plenty of parents who are loving what you're saying. And like I said, it did make a massive change to the way I parent and also educate at the moment. But if you don't mind, before we leave, I was going to get you a couple of little fun things to get to know you a bit better, if that's all right. So
sure,
I'm going to put you on the spot a bit. So some quick questions for you. Your favourite book?
Oh, there's a few. Look, probably my most favourite is it's a book. I think it's called Meat. Something like, I think it's written by someone called Fairchild, and it's a really eloquent examination of the evidence as to whether or not it's actually bad for us or the environment to eat meat.
Okay.
It's been around a while. And I wish I could remember here it is. Meat, A Benign Extravagance by Simon Fairley.
By Simon Fairley. All right. Can I ask you on that point too, which book did you enjoy writing the most?
Enjoy writing? Actually, I enjoy them all. And probably the answer to that is always the latest one.
Okay. Yeah.
Because it's the one that I'm thinking about most of the time. But writing is not a task to me because I enjoy the research and trying to communicate what I'm finding. Yeah. It's generally the latest one.
Okay. Your favourite hobby or leisure activity?
Writing books.
Favourite food?
Look, my absolute favourite food, and this is from pre-quitting sugar days, but luckily my wife has found a way to recreate it without sugar, which is vanilla ice cream with chocolate sauce over the top.
Oh, my God, that does sound good. Favourite drink?
This is really boring, but if you'd asked me this when I was consuming sugar, it would have been Coke. Mm-hmm. If you ask me now, soda water.
Okay.
I just find it more interesting than just water.
Okay, nice. Do you have a favourite movie?
Probably The Blues Brothers.
I was going to say, you probably don't have time for movies by the time you're doing all this research and writing books and being a lawyer and everything else.
I don't watch a lot of movies, to be honest, but yeah, probably The Blues Brothers.
Right, yeah. What about favourite music or music style?
Yeah, I generally just like pretty old-fashioned rock. I like anything with a bit of a beat to it. Like Rolling Stones.
Okay, yep.
Bands like Jet. Just things like that.
All right. Favourite holiday destination?
Oh, the only one I've ever had, which is I've ever since I was knee high to a grasshopper, I was holidayed up at Caloundra at the Sunshine Coast, and still do.
Nice. The favourite thing about your career?
That I haven't had one. In the sense that I haven't had one. I've done a lot of different things, and never been able to predict what the next thing would be. So it's the fun of doing what I find interesting.
Yeah, nice. All right. How about some quick word associations? So the first thing that comes to your mind when we talk about these things, coffee.
Sure. Tea.
Oh, I was going to say tea next, so that's gone. Guest speaking.
Fun. It is fun.
Enjoy it? Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
Writing.
Interesting.
Family.
Fun. Yeah, it's fun again. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, that's the break I get. When I'm not writing or working, I'm with family.
Okay. Junk food.
What's that?
Schooling.
Glad it's over for both me and my kids.
Teenagers.
Stressful.
Very good answer. All right, we're down to the last few questions. What is David doing if he's down to his last $20?
How do you mean? Sorry, what?
You're down to your last $20? Yep.
Yeah.
What are you buying with that $20?
Oh, probably food.
Okay. All right, now you've got food. If you had to have a last meal, what would it look like?
Oh, probably steak and chips.
Oh, nice basic. I love that. Now, this is what I'm looking forward to hearing you say. I say this to a few people and I get some really random responses. David is now, this is completely off topic, David is now on a deserted island and he's stuck with 3 people. Who does he want to be stuck with and why?
Oh, wow. Probably my wife and two of the more useful of my children.
We won't name names.
But one of the engineers would be good.
Okay. So we won't name names, you'll be safe then. Look, I have just enjoyed your time. Is there anything I sort of haven't asked you that you'd like to discuss or chat about?
No. I think we've done enough. I think.
Oh, mate, you've done. It's amazing. And again, I just reached out to you and the trust that I had to have this conversation, and it inspires me every time. Look, I'm trying to make a difference even with the parents we talk to, and also just make people aware of our own kids. And if it wasn't for your book, and I mean this, it wouldn't have changed or shaped my life. So you've definitely made an impact on our family. I want to thank you for that.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm looking forward to the next books. What's the next thing on the agenda with the book?
The next one, well, look, this is my working title because it's what I use when I'm writing it. I guarantee it won't be called this, but I'm calling it Contrary to Popular Belief, and it's sort of a collection of things that we're told that turn out to be nonsense. Nice. Like, for example, that sunscreen prevents sunburn or things like that. So going through a bunch of things that I've noticed over the years that aren't really book length, but long enough for me to write something about it, and collecting those together in a single book.
Love it. Well, all the best with that too. And again, I want to thank you for coming on to the show on GW Unspoken.
Oh, absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for chatting with me.